Okay, charges of anthropomorphism in debates about biological agency. So before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that this project is supported by the John Templeton Foundation for the project using experimental models to investigate how agency can arrive and evolve. So I just wanted to say a special thank you to my team members at University of Calgary, Ken Waters, Ahmed Al-Jahani, and Sydney During, and Niall Rowe at University of Cambridge for helping with feedback on this project. So thank you. So before I begin with my main argument, I'll just give a bit of background on biological agency more generally, and what this position involves. So scientists and philosophers of science have recently been advancing the position that it makes sense to describe the activities of biological organisms as agential. This position is motivated by the fact that when an organism acts, we can describe its activities by referencing a goal towards which that action was directed. So, for example, when describing a bacterium moving towards a higher concentration of nutrients, we can say that bacterium had the goal of consuming nutrients, and we can explain its activity by referencing that goal. So in this understanding of agency, agents are organisms with the capacity for goal-directed behavior. There are different ranges that proponents of an agency approach are willing to ascribe agency. Some will restrict descriptions to organisms with certain kinds of cognitive abilities, and some will apply it more broadly. I'll be calling the approaches that ascribe agency to all biological organisms broad approaches to ascribing agency, and I'll be referencing approaches given by Salton et al., who talks about agency or motivates agency by the concept's ability to allow us to bridge explanatory gaps. So if we understand organisms as self-sustaining or maintaining stable functioning, then we can describe certain activities or explain certain activities by referencing its goal to maintain a kind of stable functioning. Philip Ball talks about distinguishing organisms from being agents rather than mere products. He's thinking about agency specifically in the context of evolution, so rather than being products of evolution, or by talking about organisms as like reducing our explanation of an organism's activity to a gene-centered approach, or describing its activity by referencing traits, we can talk about the organisms as a whole and the goals that the organisms have. So these broad approaches to ascribing agency are often criticized or talked about either critically or supportively as being anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphism I'm understanding as the tendency to ascribe human qualities or capacities to non-human organisms when there isn't adequate evidence to do so. And then my goal in this paper is essentially to determine whether or not these charges are warranted. It's important to note that critiques of an agency approach or charges of anthropomorphism aren't the main way of critiquing an agential approach. They're not often like central to people's arguments, but I think it's an important question to ask whether or not these charges are warranted, because it helps shed light on the kinds of assumptions that are underpinning our conversations about agency generally. So, brief overview of my presentation. I'll be arguing first that biases can be helpful or harmful, so I'll suggest that the mere fact that there's a bias present doesn't give us reason to reject that theory. Rather, we need to show that the bias is harmful rather than helpful. Secondly, I'll take a look at the way charges of anthropomorphism are presented in the literature on agency. And then go on to argue that while anthropomorphism has been discussed extensively in the literature on agency, the problem of anthropocentric bias hasn't been given enough attention. And then I'll additionally argue that anthropocentric bias is present in the literature on agency, and that not only is it a bias, but it's a harmful bias, and the presence of anthropocentric bias in charges of anthropomorphism makes the charges not warranted in these debates. So biases can be helpful or harmful. Bias in scientific research is unavoidable. Scientists are socially situated individuals whose values and experiences will influence the kinds of explanations and hypotheses that will appear salient to them. I'll be using a definition of bias provided by Louise Antony, who describes bias as any structure, database, or inferential disposition that serves as a non-evidential way to reduce hypothesis space down to a tractable size. So in this understanding of agency, bias plays a constructive role in scientific practice. It's not merely a defect of our epistemic capacities, but rather sometimes we're required to employ biases when our hypothesis space is so broad that we simply don't have the resources to engage with every potential hypothesis or explanation that might be available to us. So our efforts should be to use the right kind of biases and avoid the unhelpful ones. Yes, so on this understanding of bias, a helpful bias is one that allows us to avoid false or unreliable hypotheses, generally speaking, and the harmful biases cause us to form unreliable hypotheses or to, generally speaking, lead us away from truth. So this understanding of bias links the merits or faults of a particular bias to its tendency to help us form reliable judgments or succeed in achieving the aims of our inquiry. So in debates about agency, it's not the mere presence of a bias, but whether the bias is helpful or not that will warrant whether or not it should be present. So to get into charges of anthropomorphism in these debates, there seem to be two ways of talking about anthropomorphism in the agency literature. The first is as a harmful bias. I'll be looking at accounts given by DeFrisco and Gahn and Viet. The second is that while it is a bias, it actually serves as a helpful heuristic, and so it is warranted. Yes. So the accounts that talk about anthropomorphism as a harmful bias, DeFrisco and Gahn talk about biological agency as a cryptively cognitive concept. So they argue that because our common understanding of agency involves an agent, typically a human agent, consciously setting a goal, coming up with intentions, and then going about certain activities to achieve that goal or to realize the goal. Because that's our common understanding of agency, it seems too far of a stretch to extend that to describe the activity of, say, that bacteria moving towards higher concentrations of nutrients. And they argue that we can explain our tendency to be anthropomorphic by a bias we have towards interpreting systems as agential when we don't necessarily have evidence to do so. In that article, they give a lot of other reasons for rejecting an agential approach, but this is kind of how they talk about anthropomorphism. Walter Viet argues that agential thinking might be able to generate new hypotheses. It might be true that it can be helpful, but ultimately argues that agential language risks making value-neutral hypotheses seem less intuitive. So he's referencing a specific study in microbiology where a microbe was where language like cooperator and cheater were being used to describe microbes in a system and an organism that was described as a cheater. had activities that ended up leading to increased fitness for the group. So he argued in that case, because there was kind of normative baggage in our agential terms, it made the kind of value neutral hypotheses that it wasn't like doing something negative seem less intuitive. So he argues that because a lot of agential language contains this kind of normative baggage, it's not useful to generate helpful hypotheses. On the other hand, anthropomorphism as a helpful heuristic, Okasha argues that it doesn't make sense to use agential language literally to describe organisms that lack complex cognitive or psychological capacities similar to human beings. But agential language can help us capture what he calls a unity of purpose that all organisms seem to exhibit. Ogren and Patton argue that anthropomorphism can be licensed or not licensed. So it can be licensed when it's used to generate new hypotheses. They challenge the kind of argument given by Viet by arguing that both anthropomorphism and its avoidance have the potential to block the generation of new hypotheses. So efforts should be made to use it in the right context rather than avoid using it at all. Oh, I don't think yes. So as I've pointed out, anthropomorphism has received extensive attention in the literature on agency, but anthropocentric bias hasn't been adequately accounted for. In comparative psychology, both of these concepts have been discussed, so I'll be using some of the literature, drawing from some of the literature on anthropocentric bias in comparative psychology to gain some insight in how we can apply these findings to anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism in debates about agency. So a lot of the tendency to avoid, or the principle to strictly avoid anthropomorphism in comparative psychology comes from this principle called Morgan's canon. Essentially, Morgan's canon suggests that researchers should be prohibited from describing behavior in terms of what he calls higher psychological capacities, when that same behavior can be described by ones that he calls lower on the psychological scale. So this reasoning is supposed to kind of stand in opposition to a Darwinian understanding of a relationship of continuity between the capacities of humans and other organisms. And the point of the principle is based on the assumption that humans have this tendency to over-attribute their capacities to other organisms. So if we have this kind of conservative principle to prevent us from doing this, then this is supposed to perhaps balance out our tendency to anthropomorphize. But scholar Franz de Waal argues that in addition to having the tendency to over-attribute, we also, for different reasons, have the tendency to under-attribute the capacities we have to other animals. So he coins this term anthropodenial that's supposed to serve as kind of a counterpart to anthropomorphism. Yes, where it explains the tendency to under-attribute. So many have argued that Morgan's canon unreasonably limits our concern to anthropomorphism when errors of under-attribution should also be a concern for us. So if anthropomorphic bias is what gives rise to our errors of over-attribution, what then can explain our errors of under-attribution? De Waal and Scotto have identified the cause of this tendency as anthropocentric bias. So anthropocentric bias is talked about differently in different contexts. There are moral dimensions of centering humans in moral relationships, or metaphysical dimensions of anthropocentrism that will suggest that humans occupy, say, like a higher status in the order of being. But I'll be using this definition given by Scotto. I think it works well in this context. So in this sense, anthropomorphism is, quote, the tendency to consider that human ways of experiencing, conceiving, and thinking provide the criterion or gold standard for understanding the behavior of non-human animals. So if we think about this in the context of agency, it would involve the assumption that human agency is that kind of paradigm or gold standard for understanding agency, and when we want to ascribe agency to other organisms, we should compare it to human agency. So using this kind of bias also seems to presuppose a categorical distinction between human capacities and the capacities of other organisms. By putting the human capacity at the center, you're kind of giving this special and distinct place relevant to the capacities of other organisms. So the way that this explains under-attribution is if someone holds that there's a categorical distinction rather than a merely gradual one, then they'll be less willing to ascribe the capacities they have to other organisms. So if we want to apply the critiques from comparative psychology to biological agency, it's important first to take special note that critiques in comparative psychology focus on the attribution of psychological capacities to non-human organisms, but in the agency literature, accounts the broad approaches describing agency that I've talked about don't uniformly understand agency to be a psychological capacity in the first place. So Sultan et al. Talk about agency as a dynamical property of a system, and Ball talks about agency as a real biological phenomenon, argues that it's physically explainable. We don't need to appeal to any extra physical influences to talk about agency. Importantly, neither of the accounts require that organisms possess like complex cognitive or psychological capacities. So what can't be applied is the concern about attributing psychological capacities, but what can be applied is the concern about assuming a categorical distinction between humans and other organisms, or to assume that human agency is somehow the model case of agency. So anthropocentric bias applied to the literature on biological agency. We can first see it, I argue, in charges of harmful anthropomorphic bias. So this was DeFrisco and Gahn and Viet. And I argue that because both center their understanding of agency around the human manifestation of it, we can see this because they both require that agency requires the kinds of complex cognitive capacities or psychological abilities that humans have. So we can see implicitly that they center their understanding of agency around the human form. So I argue that this is a case of harmful anthropocentric bias. Both of their accounts count as a bias. Recall our definition of bias was non-evidential reasons for reducing hypothesis space down to a more tractable size. So explanations for the behavior of an organism are limited by a human-centered understanding of agency. They're non-evidential reasons for this limitation because empirical observations, while they give us reason to attribute agency, they don't tell us how to center our understanding of agency in the first place. I argue that this is a harmful bias and not a helpful one because it preemptively rules out what I've called the broad approaches to ascribing agency. So if it's still a live question whether agency requires complex cognitive or psychological states, which it appears to be given the diversity of accounts that exist in literature, then frameworks that contain the background assumption that the kind of agency that manifests in human beings should be considered the model case of it, both impedes relevant alternatives from being considered and prevents productive conversations about the kinds of activities that should count as agential. So for accounts of anthropocentric bias and accounts of useful anthropomorphism, the fact that that these kinds of accounts allow for the use of agential language, at least in some contexts, to describe the activities of organisms that lack psychological states, might make it seem as though they're less influenced by anthropocentric bias than the accounts of harmful anthropocentric bias. But I argue that these accounts do also contain harmful anthropocentric bias, because once again, they out of the gate assume that agency requires the kinds of psychological capacities that humans have. So because attributions of agency to organisms that lack these human-like capacities are only permissible in a non-literal sense, it's clear that this assumption is present, and that they're kind of preemptively ruling out the broad approaches in the same kind of way. So for the same reasons outlined in the previous section, this is also harmful anthropocentric bias. So we can see this in Okasha, where he describes or argues that non-cognitive organisms can exhibit a unity of purpose that's, he calls it, analogous to that of humans, such that there is, quote, a real pattern in nature that is captured by treating an organism as if it is an agent pursuing a goal. The fact that there's a real pattern relating human intentional agency and non-intentional, non-psychological agency such that they function as analogs of one another serves as reason to ask the question of whether they are merely analogs of two distinct capacities or just two kinds of the same capacity. So it's reasonable to ask why we're prohibited from using agential language literally if the non-literal ascription captures a real pattern. But we're prevented from doing so by the presupposition that humans are the model cases of agency. So choosing to categorically distinguish human agency from other potential forms of it prevents us from exploring this plausible alternate hypothesis. So the presence of anthropocentric bias in these cases constitutes a harmful bias and not a helpful one. So to summarize, charges of anthropomorphism in debates about biological agency, it might be true that humans possess some form of anthropomorphic bias or intentionality bias that causes us to have a tendency to overattribute the kinds of capacities we have to other organisms. But in debates about biological agency, charges of anthropomorphism, whether they're critical or supportive, are not warranted because there isn't strong enough reason to understand agency as a distinctively human capacity in the first place. So the accounts discussed in this paper that make allegations of anthropomorphism, I've argued, center their understanding of agency around human agency, but other accounts of agency, such as those of Salton et al. And Ball, do not. So literal ascriptions of agency are warranted according to Ball and Salton et al. By virtue of how an organism acts and not by whether it has psychological capacities. So it doesn't matter whether these organisms have the kinds of cognitive capacities that humans do for agency to be reasonably attributed to them. And if it doesn't matter whether an organism has psychological capacities or complex cognitive abilities, then charges of anthropomorphism against these accounts just don't make sense because they rest on the false premise that a psychological capacity has been attributed when in reality it has not. So because this way of attributing agency doesn't make sense to be labeled as anthropomorphic bias, both the accounts that label it as a harmful bias and the ones that label it as a helpful one are mistaken. What does the work to motivate the charges of anthropomorphism is the anthropocentric background assumption that human agency should be understood as the model case. Because anthropocentric background assumptions are required to motivate charges of anthropomorphism, it isn't plausible that they can be easily removed. So rather than productively engaging with the kinds of theories that suggest that different kinds of capacities can give rise to agency, accounts that make charges of anthropomorphism presuppose that this is not the case, and for this reason, charges of anthropomorphism are not warranted in these debates. It's not working, but thank you. Yeah.
couple of minutes for the, can I? No.
I can hold it if it's.
No, thank you. I can use Shauna. I'm sorry. Okay, now we can start. I'm sorry. It's all right. So can I see the hands again, please? Okay, let's start from here. Thank you.
Hi, great talk. I'm wondering about if you could say a little more about the I guess the bias behind agency and it being non-evidential. And what I have in mind is like something you might think is like behavioral evidence, where so it appears that the organism is acting towards some goal, but there's also maybe some behavioral flexibility that we think might be important for capturing that they're like goal directed rather than just like activating stimulus response. And I guess the reason why I think this is important is because like traditionally people will like cut off plants as like non-agential, because they're clearly just insofar as they are behaving, it's just like stimulus response. But then like there's this growing community of people who are like actually maybe plans of agency because they have this behavioral flexibility, but it seems like they're gathering evidence about behavior. In these cases. So I was wondering if you could just say more about it being not being evidentially based to attribute agency.
Yeah, so what I was describing as not having an evidential basis was our decision about how to like center our understanding of agency. So we first need to have a definition of agency before we decide whether or not it's attributed. I'd mostly focused on the accounts that talk about anthropomorphism as kind of making the non-evidential decision to center our understanding of agency like around the human form of it. Some of that, the reasoning comes from like how the term is commonly used. But I think the accounts, like the broad approaches to ascribing agency, might argue that there can be evidential reasons, but they aren't able to say that if there's this presupposition that our account of agency is like centered around the human form of it. So I guess, yeah, my comments about like the non-evidential reasons were mostly about like how we're understanding the term in the first place. I'm not sure if that answers, but yeah.
Thank you. That was an excellent talk. I was interested in the fact that you were talking about how agency doesn't necessarily require the higher psychological capabilities. And I was thinking about how there is kind of a reverse of this problem when talking about like simulated model systems, where I don't see a lot of people ascribing agency to these systems, but it does. People do ascribe things like learning and memory to these systems, which are these psychological capacities. And I wondered if in your reading you've thought anything about that.
Yeah, I definitely bracketed off the question of like non-biological agency, but like debates about like cybernetics, and there are a lot of like current debates on whether we can ascribe agency to non-living beings. Depending, like some of the broad approaches that I've described are perfectly okay with saying that that like machines or computers can count as agents. Some of them will say, yep, that's fine. Some of them will say that might be fine, but it doesn't really make a difference. We're concerned about the biological organisms. And some of them will make decisions to restrict the agency just to the living organisms. They'll have different reasons for doing this. Some might just be like by stipulation. Some I haven't found the arguments particularly convincing, the ones that try to like make an argument for that case, not just by stipulating. So yeah, it's definitely something that I've thought about. It would maybe make my account a bit too broad to discuss, but it's definitely something that I think about for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great talk. I think this is just like a kind of a food for thought, that one objection that you could consider in the paper and the talk, and then try to respond to it, that will make your case even stronger, is that one worry that I think people like Okasha have about attributing agency is, normally in sciences, let alone physics or also biology, we normally, when we introduce a term, it's introduced to a whole body of a theory, and it's there with specific meaning because it helps us with empirical adequacy and explanatory adequacy of our theories. And especially in biology, people are very careful. Then when we say, oh, mammalian immune system, it's not just a term that we introduce. It's just we could specify its genetic components, its evolutionary background, and it's shared among all these mammalians, and we don't, and it has a specific structure, and we could infer we have a legitimate claim to carving out this inferential domain and make some explanation there. So there is a worry that we have to always, in biological explanation, we shouldn't go fully functional. There should be a marriage between functional and a mechanical explanation. And it seems to me that this is an objection, that how do we see this marriage between functional and mechanical explanation with a specific genetic and I don't know, organismic correlates of the term. And yeah, that's one thing that was interesting for me, that maybe the way that I understand Okasha was a kind of a worry about that. Otherwise, like, I could call this cup an agent because it's a dynamical system that is resisting dissolving into nature. It's like anything could be called agents, and I cannot infer agency of this guy to the agency of a human and the agency of an elephant. It's like too vague to add anything to my theoretical understanding. So that's one worry, I think. Thank you. Sorry, Tula.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the suggestion. Yeah, there's definitely accounts, like off the top of my head, I think of like Dennis Walsh, who has argued that like he uses the term teleological, but I think we can also just plug in agential, and mechanistic accounts are like independent, but they're both there. So maybe that's maybe a rejection of the idea that they have to be like strictly together. But yeah, it's something I'll look into. Different approaches have like different like understandings of the relationship between the agency and the like mechanism, or like the genetic physical explanations. Philip Ball talked about how it, like agential processes can be physically explainable. It's just a different kind of explanation. With the second worry about the fact that it's too vague to add anything to our theory, I think generally speaking, the response that's given would be that we'd focus on using the agential explanations in cases where there seem to be gaps between what we want to explain and what our like mechanistic or gene-centered theories can do. So when Sultan is talking about like bridging the explanatory gaps, we're starting with cases where we might have like a completely mechanistic explanation. We can see kind of what implements like the gene, or we can completely spell out like the genetic like composition or give that explanation, but it's not going to, because they're different mechanistic approaches can lead to the same kind of outcome. It doesn't explain the activity in the same as easily as the like agential approach will. So I guess the response to the vagueness is that we're kind of focusing the explanation on cases where there are already gaps. But it's definitely something I should work out a clear response to. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Super clear talk and really enjoyed it. I have a question about another potential use of agency by biologists to see if it's kind of compatible with your framework. This would be a sort of non-literal use that's maybe sneaky on their part. The proposal would be that sometimes biologists are using agency to highlight some factors as most relevant causes in a kind of context. So, like social scientists and cognitive scientists have shown that like when we're reasoning, if we think of something as an agent, we're just more likely to view it as a more relevant cause. There's this sociologist, Charles Tilley, who talks about standard stories, where when we tell stories, we highlight agents and they do things and they make decisions and they get our main attention. This can lead us, he suggests, to downplay the important causal role of social structures that it's harder to view as agents. And it leads us to overemphasize the like importance of things that do look like true agents. In some cases, you can see the use of this where in telling stories, we sometimes turn an inanimate object into an agent to tell a story. So there was this like Schoolhouse Rock episode of how a bill turns into a law. And it was this like scroll of paper and you like popped eyes on it and it's got arms and legs. And then you tell a story about this like, I'm just a bill. And so the suggestion is to highlight relevant causes. There might be this strategy of calling them agents. And I wonder if in this more like non-literal sneaky use, you could still use your framework to say, hey, that is good if they are a good, like a main cause, but it's bad if they're not a main cause. So just wondering what you think about this potential role of agency language where it has this goal, this use of suggesting something is like a main cause.
Yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion. Thank you. And I'll definitely look more into it. I hadn't thought as much about how like once we have an agent, we consider that a more main cause than not. So I'll definitely look in the literature and psychology about that one. Also, an interesting suggestion of using like non-biological things that we, even the broad approaches, might not ascribe agency to, and the question of, it seems as though you're suggesting that maybe in those cases where it seems that there is like a genuine metaphorical use of the term, a genuine non-literal sense of the use, then the way we evaluate whether or not it's warranted is based on whether we deem it to be kind of a main cause. And yeah, I'll have to think more about that because I hadn't really thought about it in kind of like used as like a communicative tool, like in that way. So I'll definitely have to think more, but it's a good suggestion. So thank you.
Charles Tilley.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to follow up on that point. So definitely, we're doing a study right now where we're assessing the prevalence of anthropomorphic language in scientific articles, and and it's very informal, and I don't think scientists realize it's happening. And I think that that's quite different than what you're studying, which is, there is an actual account that ascribes a particular kind of agency to something. The way that scientists also use anthropomorphic language is in this informal way to highlight something that maybe doesn't have human qualities. One of the particular frames where that shows up that I think is troubling to me, and I'm curious about your perspective, is that sometimes the language takes the human out of the argument and ascribes agency to the data. So the data argue, or the results or the finding concludes, or the model concludes, and the turn there removes the scientist as the person who's doing the arguing and the concluding, and puts a primacy on the data, I think to emphasize objectivity, and to hide the fact that actually this is subjective and there is a scientist in the loop here. Yeah, and I'm kind of curious whether you have a perspective on that particular use.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting thought and definitely helpful. Yeah, I would say that probably you can distinguish between the kinds of cases that I'm talking about and that kind of case by saying that, well, in the case of talking about anthropomorphism, where we're ascribing capacities, when we have a case of maybe a disagreement, someone says that you're being anthropomorphic with that ascription, then we can take a step back and analyze, well, is it right to call that anthropomorphic if it's just this broad kind of claim, like walking, we walk differently than other organisms, so it wouldn't be anthropomorphic to call another kind of walking because it's not centered around our human understanding. In the case of like the data explain or the findings argue, maybe we could say that when we take a step back and we say, according to my account, we would maybe have to ask the question, is it right to center our understanding of showing or arguing around like either human or living organisms, or should we allow it to be the case that data or results can show? And I think intuitively, I might want to say that once we take that step, we can say that no, like maybe grammatically even, it doesn't make sense to understand data as arguing just by virtue of the meaning. I might think more about that, but I might want to say that, yeah, when you take a step back and apply the same analysis, then you would get the result that maybe that is a genuine anthropomorphism, or depending on what organisms you take to be able to like show or argue, maybe it's like a mammal morphism or animal morphism. People have coined different words to avoid like human centering what can be like morphism, but yeah, that's helpful to think about. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Larissa. Thanks. Now